Will Vladimir Putin use nuclear weapons? That has been one of the questions that's been vexing many in the West from the beginning. And at the first, in 2022, a lot of people were concerned about that. They wanted to go carefully. And then as alleged red lines were crossed and the months and months that kept passing on and new weapon systems and more sophisticated Western weapons found their way onto the battlefield, nothing ever happened. No nuclear weapons were used. So a lot of people think, well, they're not going to use them anymore. But there have been a growing number of comments and actions coming out of Russia, specifically out of Vladimir Putin, as well as some developments on the battlefield on both sides of the line that are starting to cause some to be even more concerned. And I think a lot of this is catching the West by surprise. And one of the reasons why we love to do this Daniel Davis deep dive is because we're going to bring you things that you're not getting on major news networks. And this is going to be one of those cases here where many people are going to be surprised by some of the things we talk about here and some of the evidence we physically provide. And one of the great guests we have on our show to try and unpack some of this, especially when it has to do with the Russia-Ukraine war, is Colonel Jacques Baud, former member of the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service, former NATO member, former armor officer, and just an all-around intelligent guy. Welcome back to the show, Colonel.
Thank you. Thank you for having me back to the show. Thanks.
And you know, sometimes I wish we could just have some pleasant conversation, reminiscing about some things that are on a pleasant level or so. It seems like we're always talking about, you know, potential destruction of the world or whatever. And unfortunately, this is going to be another one of those. But it's really important, I think, to get to the truth of what's going on, to truly understand what's at stake, and where some of our policies and our current actions might take us and how we need to change directions. And I think that's absolutely vital that we do. I want to start off talking, first of all, about some of the things Putin has said very recently, because a week or so ago, the United States announced that it was going to deploy intermediate ballistic missiles on German territory, which as I understand is a result of our getting out of the one of the ABM treaties. I think it was anti-ballistic missile treaty, which we got out of and said, oh, it's antiquated, we don't need to do it anymore. And now then we're talking about introducing a new level of missiles into Germany. And as we had an MIT professor, Ted Postel, on to talk about it, see, he was very, very alarmed by that, saying that Russia would almost certainly take countermeasures. And now it appears that that's exactly what has happened. Here's what Vladimir Putin said just a couple of days ago on that topic.
The situation recalls the events of the Cold War era. If the U.S. implements such plans, we will consider ourselves free from the previously imposed one-sided moratorium on the deployment of medium and shorter-range strike systems. We will take mirror measures for their deployment.
And that mirror measures, that's something that I've heard before from the Russians. And I wonder if you can kind of give your view on what they mean by that, because Russia has always, all the way back during the Cold War, was very often talked about how they would go this tit for tat. Whatever the West would do, they would do the same kind of thing in response. But then now here lately, a lot of American commentators, and this is something that's going to be a theme of this show, I think, say, man, they don't really mean that. He's just bluffing. Actually, let me ask you that first question. Do you think Vladimir Putin is bluffing?
No, the Russians never bluff. That's we can consider it as a rule of thumb. They don't bluff. When they say something, that means they are able to do it and are ready to do it, if so. So what Vladimir Putin is saying, in fact, reflects the reality. I myself, when I was in strategic intelligence during the Cold War, I was caught in the middle of that issue of the missiles in the late 80s, when the U.S. I mean, that started earlier, but when the U.S. started to deploy the Pershing II missile in Western Europe, Germany and Belgium in particular, and as a result, what the Russians did at the time, they just improved their SS-12 missile into the SS-22. And for a while, the US, and I was talking very actively with the CIA at the time, and for a while they had in mind that the Russians, or the Soviets at the time, had created a new missile, which was the SS-22, but eventually it appeared that it was just a modification of the SS-12 missile, and therefore what we used at the time the denomination of SS-12-22. But that was the response of the Soviet to the deployment of the Persian missiles in Western Europe. So my view is that I don't know exactly what the Russians have on the shelves that they could deploy, or I mean, equivalent weapons to the missile that the U.S. wants to deploy. I mean, they would like to deploy hypersonic missiles that they don't have. By the way, the Russians have them, so that would be for them very easy to deploy them. And as to the Tomahawk and other long-range cruise missiles, I mean, the Russians have certainly, I'm not aware of all the details of the cruise missiles, but they certainly have something equivalent to what the US has. So I think the Russians are ready, and for them, it's not a big deal to deploy such weapons in western part of Russia and even in Belarus. Remember that in March 23, after the US tried to make some kind of a very strange exercise, by the way, by moving a B-52 squadron to Europe and mocking a nuclear attack against St. Petersburg. And that was in the Gulf of Finland. And after that, that was prompted the decision of Vladimir Putin to deploy nuclear weapons on the Belarus territory. But this attack, it was a mock-up attack, if you want, because these B-52, I mean, there was one B-52 I'm aware of, maybe others, but the one I'm aware of was B-52 that was traced by some you have those websites that trace the displacement of aircraft, and that was clearly a simulated attack against Russia. And for that reason, the Russian had a response. So I think the Russians have a wide range of possible response beyond going into the nuclear commitment, if you want to commit nuclear weapons.
And in fact, let's look at some of those alternatives, because that's not the only tit for tat, the only mirror operations that we need to be worried about. Here is the Polish Foreign Minister Sikorski, also just a few days ago, being asked whether he agreed with Ukraine limiting where it struck inside of Russia with Western missiles. He had a very predictable comment, but we'll see about the consequences on the backside. Watch this.
The Russians have no compunctions about using missiles to hit hospitals, including children's hospitals, whereas we are preventing Ukrainians from using weapons to their full extent. This doesn't strike me as fair. Ukraine is a victim of a naked act of aggression. Mr. Putin is a designated war criminal. As the international community, we have the duty to help the victim of aggression to defend herself, respecting rules of humanitarian rules of war. But the victim can also strike the territory of the aggressor. I mean, there is Ukraine should not be forced to fight with one hand behind her back, tied behind her back.
So let's just take that apart and look at different aspects of it. First of all, obviously for his side, he continues to talk about the naked aggression, and like there was no reason for this word, just came out of nowhere and they just attacked. I won't bother with that. But he's talking in the second part there about how really that because Russia and Ukraine are at war, they should be able to fire anything they want anywhere. Two questions. First of all, will that matter? Let's say that they get plenty of long-range missiles, as many as they want. Is that going to make a difference on the ground, on the front lines?
Oh, that will not make any difference. By the way, when we talk about nuclear, I mean, the use of nuclear weapons, In the Russian doctrine, this is stated extremely clearly that this kind of weapon can be used only if there are existential issues related to the state of Russia, meaning that if it is a threat against, let's say, bombing or artillery fire, whatever, on Moscow, on the government or institutions, fundamental institutions, or if they are a threat against the uh, uh, against items that could prevent the use of nuclear weapons, by the way. That's why, for instance, attacks against early warning radars and things like this could lead to something very serious, because that might be considered by the Russians as existential. But what happens on the ground in Ukraine is not considered as existential. Not even the territory, which is considered as Russian, like the four regions or oblasts that Russia occupies partially, or mostly partially, like Kherson, Zaporozhye, Lugansk, and Donetsk, including Crimea, by the way. This is Russian territory, but even an attack on this part of the Russian territory is not considered as existential for the for the Russians.
Right,
What
right. But
That's
what
very important.
sure, yeah, and I'm going to get to what some of the things that might be a nuclear trigger subsequently, but even keeping it at the conventional level, keeping it with the concept of mirror for mirror move, what might Russia do if these missiles, especially if they go further up into mainland Russia?
No, if we are. I'm not sure about your question. If it's a mirror reaction to the deployment of nuclear weapons in Western Europe.
No. I'm sorry. I'm talking. He was talking about that Ukraine, the Sikorsky, was that Ukraine missiles, long range missiles provided by the West, should be free to fire anywhere into
Oh,
Russia
yes, no.
mainland. So that's what I'm talking about
Sorry,
on a conventional
sorry,
level.
I misunderstood the question. But no, in that case, they have enough conventional missiles to as a response to this. I mean, they have those hypersonic missiles that we have seen in action since the very first weeks of the war, and so the Russians have a wide range of arsenal and a wide range of missiles that they can use as a response to any kind of attack. And I'm not sure that even if they'd say ATACMS missile would be used, and even if they would be used against, let's say, Moscow, for instance, or let's take the Scalp or Storm Shadow cruise missiles, they might be in the range of Moscow. But I'm not sure that even those attacks might not be considered as existential or existential enough for nuclear weapons. And the Russians have enough weapons to reply to this kind of attacks. They would intensify the attacks against the the Russian, let's say, cities and installation. You can see, for instance, that the attack that was mentioned by the Mr. Sikorsky on this hospital. I will not discuss the matter whether it was a Russian or Ukrainian missile, but the interesting fact is that this event occurred during the attack of the Artyom production facility, which is a military production facility, and that means, and it's a rather big, by the way, in Ukraine, in Kiev, and that was the objective of the attack, of the Russian attack. That means that the Russians have a wide catalog of possible objectives, and they use this catalog with to increase the pressure, if you want. And that's exactly what we have seen also in the Odessa region and in other cities. And the same happened, by the way, on the power grid. You could see that the items that were targeted were very benign at the very beginning, even if our media didn't even try to make the difference. but in reality, the items that are targeted changed in importance. And recently, we have seen the Russians targeting um, objects that have more relevance for the overall economy or the war economy, because the fact of the matter is that now the Ukrainian economy is a war economy, meaning that there is no longer as such a civilian objectives, because when you target, let's say, a power production plant, for instance, then it feeds the war economy. Therefore, it is considered as a military objective. So we have this whole range of targets that the Russians have. I mean, that's very comparable to what the US had done during the Cold War to target the USSR. You had an extremely wide range of catalog of targets that you could use by depending on the kind of strategy you wanted to demonstrate. Because at the end of the day, using long range weapons, you will try to send a message. You don't want to destroy the leadership, for instance, in the first instance, because if you destroy the leadership, then there is no possibility of negotiation.
Right.
So you may
Right.
want to destroy other things before. And for that, you need to have an extremely extensive, wide catalog of targets. And that's exactly what appears to me what the Russians have today in order to address Ukraine and to increase the pressure as time goes.
Right. So I'm going to show here in just a few minutes some very recent activity by the Russian side and where things may be going in the near term here. But because of the relevance on the backside of this to the potential for nuclear escalation, I want to show you a couple of things that that Putin has said in one that was several months ago, earlier this year, another one relatively recently. And then we're going to look at what the Western side thinks about some of that. So first of all, here's what Putin said from February when there was at this time talk that Macron was saying maybe we'll send some troops into Ukraine. Watch this.
They're talking about the possibility of sending NATO military contingents to Ukraine. But we remember the fate of those who once sent their contingents to our country. But now the consequences for possible interventionists will be much more tragic. We also have weapons. They know about this. As I just said, we also have a weapon that can hit targets on their territory. And they should understand that what they're doing now, trying to scare the whole world, it does risk a conflict with nuclear weapons, which means the destruction of civilization.
So on the one hand, he's sitting there saying, hey, we got weapons and we're going to use them, especially if you start sending troops into us, which I think starts to touch on that issue you mentioned about the possibility of an existential threat because of a much larger NATO force potentially if it came on there. But then the second part is he recognized that if it's used, it's literally possible for the annihilation, not just of Russia, but of mankind. And yet he still seems to say pretty emphatically, we're willing to use them.
Oh, that's probably not exactly how we should read it, because, first of all, as we had in the Cold War, we had those tactical Frog 7 missile, for instance. There were those tactical nuclear missiles. And then you had the Scud, which was considered as an operational level type of nuclear weapon. And then the other missiles, of course, the strategic ones. But as of today, the Russians do not consider tactical nuclear weapons as such. They have strategic and non-strategic weapons. And those non-strategic weapons, they can be used on the European territory. It's important for them to signal this, because if they use non-strategic weapons, that indicates that the US would not be threatened. And therefore, it's an incentive for the US not to enter in an all-out nuclear war. So this distinction is very important. But in the sub-strategic level range, don't forget that the Russians have now a type of weapon that the West doesn't have, and namely the these hypersonic missiles that in fact are a substitute for these tactical nuclear weapons that we had during the Cold War. And the fact of the matter is that these hypersonic missiles are not nuclear, meaning that they might trigger a nuclear response, but they also might not trigger a nuclear response. And that's a fact, some kind of ambiguity that is conveyed through these type of missile. But it's very important to note the importance of these long-range, non-nuclear but very high, very precise and hypersonic missiles, because they are not nuclear, meaning that they will not prompt a nuclear response, or let's say they will not prompt automatically a nuclear response. That's very important to note, and that's what Vladimir Putin is mentioning. By the way, we also have to remind that since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians have never addressed the nuclear issue at first, meaning even on the 24th of February 2022, as the Russian launched their operation, the first to mention nuclear weapons was the French Minister of Defense. And he said on that very day that Russia should be aware that NATO is a nuclear power. And I think that was the same day, or maybe the day after, that that was Liz Truss. I think she was the foreign minister of the UK. She mentioned also the use of nuclear weapons. And after that, the Russians decided to mention the nuclear weapon, and they even increased the level of preparedness of their nuclear forces. So meaning that the Russians, and they planned a limited operation, I mean limited to Ukraine, which is a huge country, I agree, but it's still limited to Ukraine. Yeah. They never implied and never said, never implied in any way that they would attack other countries. I mean, the reason and the grounds, the reasons for attacking Ukraine were clearly stated, and the rest is only Western fantasy. That must be said also. But so basically, in the Russian mind, there's absolutely no reason to engage nuclear weapons in this conflict, because that was not the purpose. And there is, I mean, nuclear weapons can be used if there is an existential threat for any nation that you may have in NATO, but that's not the case. Ukraine is not part of NATO. No NATO country has been openly threatened by Russia, and Russia has always repeatedly said that they would not attack NATO, and that was not the purpose of its operation.
Right. So, and here's one of the part of the problems I think I see from the West is whether it's Liz Truss when she was the foreign minister, or very briefly the prime minister, or any of these other people that say this, like Ben Hodges, which I'm going to show in just a second, is that they have calculated that they think that there is no risk that Russia would ever use them because of what may happen. I want to show you here. This is something fairly recent by Ben Hodges. We're going to hear from him here in a minute. But here's one of the things he said and why he says they won't use nukes.
So Russia could go nuclear. How? Would they use an ICBM, a strategic missile, against the United States because Russia was about to lose Crimea? I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen. I mean, that would guarantee Putin's death, along with hundreds of thousands of other people. So that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, well, see, I believe him when he says that doesn't make any sense to him, but we got to find out, does that make any sense to Russia? If they were going to lose Crimea, let's say that somehow, whether it was the introduction of a lot of Western troops on the ground, or some magical way that the Ukraine forces were given massive amounts of some kind of equipment that would allow Crimea to be put at risk for Russia, would Vladimir Putin say, well, I can't use nuclear weapons, or there'd be a counter response?
Oh, I don't think so. Again, Crimea, even if it's retaken by Ukraine, including with the help of NATO, it's still not an existential threat. Remember, I mean, the Russians, probably more than the Westerners, by the way, are very aware of the risk of escalation that can be prompted by the first use of nuclear weapon. So the whole thing is that definitely the Russians have made. I mean, they gave some indications that they would adjust their doctrine, because so far they had no first use doctrine. But remember that in 2022, if I'm not wrong, Joe Biden decided to abandon the no first use of nuclear weapon by the US. And that prompted also the idea on the Russian side that they should probably do the same, but probably more for deterrence purposes than for the rest. Nuclear warfare is primarily a communication warfare, if you want, and that's probably the reason. But I think even if Crimea would be threatened, I'm convinced the Russians would not use nuclear weapons to defend Crimea. They would increase their pressure. That's probably the reason why, by the way, they have prepared and they have increased the level of their armored forces. They have increased the level of weapons production. They have increased the manning of their troops, because what has not been said, but at the end of 2022, Vladimir Putin decided that the overall strength of the Russian forces would be increased to reach something like 1.3 million. I might be wrong on the figure, but I think that would be the nominal strength of the armored forces, while at the before that it was something that just below 1 million. And he decided this at the very end of 2022, meaning that the Russians are preparing since then for an armored force which can be used for a broader type of a commitment, broader than the special military operation. And that's something we have to keep in mind, that the Russians.
Right.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say that actually leads right into one of the next things I wanted to talk about. What's happening right now? And Gary, if you could throw that first series of headlines up there. These are just some things that have been happening recently. Is number one, why are Russia carrying on huge naval drills? They have conducted a second mobile nuclear missile launcher drill this month. And now then there's reports that Putin is doubling signing bonuses for volunteers to fight in Ukraine, which is adding to the number reportedly already around 40,000 per month, which they're adding to, which is building that force, which my understanding is supposed to go to 1.5 million is what they're shooting for there. But that is also coming against a Ukraine that is continuing to be weakened. And Gary, if you could throw that next one up there as well. This is very recently from the New York Times and Washington Post. These next few here, Russia punches through weakened lines in eastern Ukraine. What the part of that pullout says, military analysts say that the swift gains reflect Moscow's improved ability to exploit cracks in Ukrainian defensive lines, which have been thinned by manpower shortages and strained by relentless Russian attacks along a more than 600-mile front. In recent months, the experts say Russian forces have increasingly focused on identifying weakened and poorly organized Ukrainian units before breaking through by throwing scores of troops into armored vehicles into the battlefield. So while you have Russia building up its forces, they're getting more and more into Ukraine by General Sirski's claim in the Guardian last week. He said he believes that there by the end of this year, there could be as many as 700,000 Russian troops inside of Ukraine. And so you have more and more evidence that Russia is getting ready for something big, it appears. But to your point there, and one of the concerns is, are they limited to that? Are they limited to just taking these 4 oblasts here, or do they have bigger appetites now?
I'm not sure they have bigger appetite, but they may feel to be forced into a larger ambition, if you want, because they realize that the West is not pressing for negotiation. And therefore, as I said already, there are 3 ways this conflict can end. It's a decisive victory against Russia, which is very unlikely at this stage, a decisive victory against Ukraine, or a negotiation. Now, what we see from the West, especially Western Europe, is that they are trying to discourage Ukraine to engage into negotiations, meaning that we are heading towards a situation where the only solution to the conflict will be a decisive victory of Russia against Ukraine. Whatever decisive means. Does it mean the occupation of Kiev, the destruction of Kiev? I don't know. I don't have. I'm not in the planning of the Russian General Staff. I have no idea. But definitely, we are. I mean, the West now, by preventing Ukraine to take some steps for negotiation, the West is in fact pushing the Russians to go into a decisive victory. Now, how this will unfold, I don't really know. What I see is that we have this increase in forces in eastern Ukraine. That may indicate 2 things. First of all, we have to remember that unlike the Ukrainians, who cannot afford to rotate troops because they don't have any reserve and they are not able to rotate their troops, the Russians are very keen to rotate their troops because this prolonged war has also some effect on the mood of the Russian population, and so for many reasons, and also to have more fresh troops on the front, so they will favor more rotation of the frontline troops. That's one thing. Another explanation is that what they are doing now is to weaken the Ukrainian down to the point that the Ukrainian defense will be so weak that they can launch a very large offensive, probably not up to Kiev, because Kiev will be extremely demanding to take over, but probably to have a situation where the Ukrainians are forced to negotiate. There will be no alternative for them than just negotiating, and that might include the seizing, for instance, Odessa. Some that was mentioned several times, and this is quite probable because if you seize Odessa, that means Ukraine will be without any access to the sea, and a large part of its economy would just crumble. And if you add to this that the quotation, the FC quotation of Ukraine, just went down to sea just a few days ago, and that means that default is inevitable. That means that we are in a situation that Ukraine would not survive, and not just militarily, but also from economic point of view.
And that's actually what I want to talk, because I think one of the things that is, it's certainly to me personally very frustrating and it's anguishing when I look at the ramifications of this, is that all the things we're talking about here, which we're showing, the Washington Times is talking about this, Washington Post, New York Times, major media in the West, which have, especially in the first couple of years of this war, were almost reflexively pro-Ukraine, and and all they did was hype all the negative stuff for the Russia. But now all of a sudden, even they're going, yeah, this is not looking very good. But then you have senior Western officials, and I don't mean to pick on him, but here's Ben Hodges again, because he keeps getting that mic thrust in front of him, and people in the West keep listening to him. And instead of recognizing the need for that negotiated settlement to save more of the Ukrainian lands, he says stuff like this.
What's your current analysis of Russia's offensive?
It's dead. I mean, there's nothing they can do. They do not have the ability to knock Ukraine out of the war. Now, they're going to continue losing 1,000 soldiers a day because they don't care about their own casualties. I don't know that they can go another 2 years like this. I think that Russia is doing what they can right now, waiting for us to quit, hoping that a Trump administration will make their life easier, hoping that Ukrainians will finally quit. I think that's the best they can do right now.
And he's talking about that the Russians are going to quit, or they can't go 2 more years. And yet again, Washington Post says, hey, we've been looking at the Russian population from the inside, and they are absolutely the opposite of even thinking about quitting. In fact, they're saying press further and go more and take additional lands. There are actually a lot of them in Russia that want to continue to take all the way, even up to Kiev. And the population is completely behind Putin right now. That's why they're able to continue to recruit, not a forced mobilization, these people. So with all of these signs, why in the world would the West ignore them all and keep advocating that the Ukraine fight on the ground a battle that I don't think can be won?
Well, that's a situation. I mean, since the beginning of the war, we have heard the same judgment, like Ben Hodges and so on, repeated always the same thing. And in my first book on this, the military operation, that was Operation Z, I described exactly what we are witnessing today. And the book was published in October 2022. And that was absolutely no miracle, because the problem is that the defeat is not a problem of equipment, basically. I mean, equipment obviously plays a role, as everything plays a role in a conflict. But the main problem is that the Ukraine had not the right, if you allow me the expression, had not the right software, the right doctrine, the right command and control system to address this kind of problem. And for that reason, we could anticipate that they would fail, simply because the Russians are much more flexible in their approach to the battlefield, to the battle, simply, than the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are too much influenced by NATO. NATO is not as flexible as people think. The Russians are much more flexible in their military thinking and in the way of addressing the battlefield. They are much more flexible. I mean, they adjust to the circumstances. They adjust the command structures, and we have seen that in the past. In the West, we consider that as a weakness, but in fact, it's just the adjustment to a better situation. Remember that the Russians have attacked Ukraine with 3 different armies. In fact, the Russian army, the Donetsk, the Popular Republic of Donetsk army, and the Republic of the army of the Popular Republic of Lugansk. These are 3 different armies. They were different line of commands, so they had to be coordinated. They were not under a single command, and that's very important to understand. And after that, as of October 2022, the Russians started to merge these units, because they declared, after the referendums that we had in September 22, these armies of Lugansk and Donetsk were then considered as Russian armed forces, and therefore were integrated into a unified command. That was not portrayed as, or better said, that was portrayed as a weakness by the West. But in fact, the Russians were simply adjusting the command structure to the new the new realities on the ground, and they
Yeah.
are doing that constantly. And that's where they are extremely strong and stronger than the Ukraine. And for that reason, in fact, Ukraine is losing. Now there are other dynamics that have entered in the game, like the lack of human resources, like the lack of equipment. I mean, the Ukrainian army, for a material point of view, equipment point of view, has been destroyed 3 times if we consider the different waves of equipment that the Ukrainian armed forces received from the West. So we see that, in fact, the dynamics was unfavorable for the Ukraine from the very beginning. It was just sustained by a Western narrative, and we see that the narrative will have no impact on what will follow, because there is a point where the narrative has to be confronted with the reality, and that's exactly what we are witnessing today.
Yeah, and
That's
and I want to point something you said there. I think it needs to be highlighted, and that is that so much of Ukraine capacity has been destroyed. Not just the troops they've lost, but the equipment as well. So first, we had this huge build up before the 2023 summer offensive from the Ukraine side. There was literally thousands of combat vehicles of various types from all different European and United States countries. And then we saw it broke its teeth on the first line of the 5 Surovikin lines, and they didn't even penetrate that fully. Now then, we see that the next big batch came in, I guess it finally happened in April of this year, when the United States passed a $61 billion defense budget. And at the time that was passed, you had this particular article here was talking about how that's going to change the tide. That's going to turn things around. This is in April. And it said that the $61 billion aid package absolutely will make a difference. Former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor, told Axios it will give the Ukrainians time and resources to refit, retrain, rearm, and refresh army units in preparation for a counteroffensive later this year or early next year. And now that you've seen, since that came out, not only has nothing happened positive, it didn't stabilize the front. It continues to fall apart. And now here in the last couple of weeks, there's been some even more larger moves by Russia across the whole line of contact there. So the 2023 one didn't do anything. The one from April of this year didn't even slow it down. And now that it's the enemy side, the Russian side, is picking up steam. So upon what basis does anyone in the West want to keep hoping that there will be an offensive later in 2024? I mean, that just seems beyond the hyperbole.
This is wishful thinking. I mean, in my previous book, I mean, not the one which is behind me, The Russian Art of War, but I had a second book on the war in Ukraine. I added up all the number of tanks that Ukraine had and received from the West since the beginning of the special military operation. And if you add up all these figures, you will see that Ukraine had 3 times the number of Russian of the tanks that Russia committed to the theater of operation in Ukraine. So that means that beyond the number of equipment, beyond the quality of equipment, the quality of the command and control is essential. And that's what, in fact, what is missing in Ukraine at the end of the day. So you can make if you calculate the figures and you do some kind of beans counting, you will not reach the truth, because the reality is that command and control is essential, and that's exactly what is lacking in Ukraine. Just look at Palestine. I mean, Hamas, with much less resources than the Israelis, are able to probably not defeat the Israelis, but at least not to allow a Israeli success, despite the huge disparity in terms of equipments and logistics and all that. But they have a much better command and control, because the command and control that the Hamas has in the Gaza Strip is adapted for this kind of conflict, while the Israelis tend to have a command and control which is adapted for conventional warfare. And that's exactly where we tend to ignore the importance of command and control and the software of the war when we look at the conflict. I've been in Afghanistan. I discussed with US and Canadian officers there, and we came exactly to the same point, because the problem is that when we commit our troops overseas, especially in conditions that differ totally from the conventional warfare we were supposed to be prepared for, that means that's exactly where the Taliban can afford to have successes against the Western armies, despite a very different type of equipment, because they have a command and control which is exactly adapted for this kind of environment, for this type of conflict. And that's exactly what we have in Ukraine. And that's something that, in my view, NATO, and especially those who prepared the Ukrainian army, and I was part of those. I mean, I was not training the Ukrainian army. I didn't come from that, but I had other tasks in the framework of NATO. But I was part of this effort of NATO of, let's say, upgrading the level of the Ukrainian army. But already at that time, I noticed that we hadn't captured the essence of the warfare that was that had been conducted in 2014 in Ukraine, and therefore we didn't prepare the Ukrainians for the right type of warfare, and that's exactly the result. Is exactly what you see today.
Yeah.
So
let me ask you something. In the amount of time we have left here, let's say that things play out the way that they logically will at some point, whether sooner, whether later, and that is the Ukraine side continues to lose. And let's say, for the sake of argument, for the moment, let's say that the worst case scenario unfolds for Ukraine, and either Kiev falls or it's in danger of falling. Kharkiv, perhaps Odessa are gone too, because we didn't stop and negotiate. Here's the big question is, what would NATO do then? Because if you see the likes of Foreign Minister Sikorski from Poland making a lot of these statements, you have certainly a lot in the Baltic countries already talking about they want more aggressive NATO policies on here. There's been reports that U.S. armor has been on the move to the east here in the last few days. What concerns you about what NATO may do if Russia eventually wins the war?
This will be a political defeat for NATO countries and Western Europe, but NATO will not commit to war because, first of all, Ukraine is not a member of NATO. And for that reason, for that precise reason, you have all these bilateral agreements between Ukraine and individual NATO countries, including Poland, France, and Slovakia, and so on and so forth. So all the help that is sent to Ukraine happens under the auspices of these bilateral treaties, not under the auspices of NATO. By the way, when I was mentioning NATO before, and I was talking about NATO helping to upgrade the Ukrainian army, it was not done under the flag of NATO as such. It was done under the flag of the Partnership for Peace. Because, again, Ukraine and myself, by the way, as a Swiss officer, we were not member of NATO, but member of the Partnership for Peace, or the Council for the Partnership for Euro-Atlantic Partnership. Here we go, and that under this flag, the Ukraine was helped. So it was not even NATO as such. And that's very important to understand. NATO, as a command structure, was not directly involved in all that and will not be involved. I mean, unless there is a significant change. But I think that even with the current administration in the US, because at the end of the day, the one who will decide or will say yes or no, or have the veto rights, will be the US. But I'm not sure that the current administration and whatever the administration will be in the future, and most probably, or I mean, most probably, I don't know, but possibly the Trump administration, I'm not sure they would be willing to engage NATO for the defense of Ukraine, which is, by the way, which would be almost a hopeless type of conflict.
Right.
So that would be
for
a
many
defeat
reasons.
such as Afghanistan. You know, it's very important to understand that for Afghanistan, for instance, when the Trump administration negotiated with the Taliban the agreement for the withdrawal, if this agreement had been followed by the Biden
Yes.
administration, we wouldn't have this mess. The problem is that Biden didn't want to follow the plan that was accepted by both sides, Taliban and the US, and he wanted to delay that, meaning that the Taliban said, well, hey guys, we have an agreement. You don't respect the agreement. We were supposed to disband, you were supposed to leave by May, and now it's August, or you decide it's August. No, it's, you know, and that's the very important thing. So we have here to be very careful about the role of these administrations. I mean, when you pass from one administration to another one, I suspect there should be a transmission of the duties that respect all the agreements. So I don't know what Trump will do, but assuming, and if I read what J.D. Vance just said and what Trump said, I think the U.S., I mean, the future administration, or the possible future administration, has no intention to continue to spend money in a black hole, in a word, because that's exactly what it is.
That's
It's a
exactly
black
right.
hole.
And I assure you they're not. I have it on good authority from people who work on the inside of that administration or that campaign, and they assure you that that is correct. Well, listen, we really appreciate you coming on today, and as always, giving us this breadth of information and knowledge about how things are going to work out here and just what the reality is. So thank you so much for coming back on today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And speaking of the potential next administration, we've got a show coming up at 3:30 this afternoon on what would a President Kamala Harris do with her foreign policy specifically, and how would they respond to Israel? Is there serious friction ahead? A lot of interesting thing here. We're going to have another one of my colleagues from Defense Priorities on to talk about that. And then on Thursday, we've had the ever popular Doug McGregor back on at 11 a.m. Definitely looking forward to that. Put that on your calendar. Be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss any shows like this. And we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.